Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we are talking about usury. We're tracing it through the Catholic tradition. And in honor of our discussion of many bad economic ideas, we'll be talking about I Dress Like a Communist, which is, of course, the worst economic idea you can have. Mathew Advent has been preparing as well. He's read all but one of the books on usury in the English language, a few in Latin, and even dabbled in the German. He's been... Oh, man, no? All right, cool. No German.
No
German.
All
right, cool. You know what? We're gonna just start it right over. I've never had this many intros ever. Okay. Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. Today we're talking about usury with Mathew Advent. He's read many books. How many books? Nobody really knows. But the two of us have been talking about the subject matter in these books for the past 2 years, as he's been developing a paper, which is now out, linked in the show notes, worth a read, and will crush any silly ideas one might have about usury with the usury truth. So to talk about that today is Matt. Matt, give me a little bit of an introduction. Who on earth are you? How on earth did you get to be the only guest who has shared a meal with Cracker Barrel with me? And why usury? There you go. That's an intro.
So I'm Mathew Advent. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at Catholic University. My dissertation is on Aristotle, on the soul. I'm especially interested in his treatment of the soul and its relationship to the principal organ of the body, the seat of the soul. He thinks it's the heart. I think that has a lot of important relevance for contemporary biology. I got interested in the usury question because I've always been interested in economics. I was interested in economics before I was interested in philosophy. And I started reading Thomistic manuals of moral philosophy from sort of the end of the 19th, early 20th century, just to practice my Latin. And I noticed that they would give Thomas's argument against usury, but then they would just kind of say, don't worry about it. And they would cite like stuff from the church from the 19th century. And I was really puzzled. Like, how did this transition happen? How did we get from Thomas's really strict position where he prohibits almost all charges on a loan to this much more permissive view we see in later Thomists? And it wasn't like they forgot the argument. It was just that they would give the argument. It was just that they didn't seem to think it applied for some reason. So I got really interested in trying to trace how in the tradition this happened. And my article, which should be linked, is just sort of tracing out among later thinkers like Juan de Lugo, who's a sort of 17th century Spanish cardinal, and St. Alphonsus Liguori. There's a famous Catholic moral theologian, probably the most important Catholic moral theologian after St. Thomas. And then Cardinal Joseph Ernst van Rooij, who becomes Cardinal Archbishop of Belgium in the 20th century. I think for most of the 20th century, he's Cardinal Archbishop of Belgium. He's important in resistance to the Nazi occupation, saves a whole bunch of Jews from the Holocaust. And he dies in 1962, right before Vatican II. And so using these three thinkers to kind of track out how the tradition develops. And this is a story that I think is kind of neglected. You see people who are really worried about usury, and they never really get the later stuff right. They always rely on John Newton's book. Newton's book is really good in a lot of ways, but it also has some problems. And so I wanted to go back to the sources and really trace out how the development worked.
Gotcha. And I mean, we've talked about how a lot of people who address usury are looking back to Aquinas, other people, 12th, 13th century, where it was the most strict it had ever been. So they look at the history of usury in the Catholic Church, they grab this little spot of time, but it turns out later thinkers are a lot more permissive about charges on loans, and earlier thinkers are more permissive on charges on loans. Cool. You've also mentioned elsewhere that in the East, this wasn't really an issue. So how is the East thought differently than the West on this topic?
So I think that, and this gets into sort of what the status is of the church, what the status of the church's teaching on this is, which is something I'm not clear about. I really want to, in my paper and here, I really want to sort of set aside the theological issues. I think there's a lot of unclarity about what the actual status of the church's teaching is. But in the East, as far as I can tell, they always allowed charging low amounts of interest in the sort of the Greek Christianity, and also in Arab Christianity. In the sort of Syrian church, it seems like they always allowed it. And in the West, it seems like it was forbidden to clergy, and then that prohibition was extended to lay people. But they never really seemed to have a problem with the Jews doing it. That was never really considered to be against natural law until, I think, the 12th century. You start to see some movement. And I'm not sure. I would really like to find a historian who could like go back into the sort of, like, go look at the receipts from the sort of 12th century and see what changed. Because I think something changed that made people really worried about it. I don't know if it's because the papacy was like the most important banking institution in Europe at the time, and so it was just sort of reforming corruption in the church, or what it could be. I think maybe it might be related to the Crusades, but I don't know. That's just conjecture on my part.
Right. And it seems like, I like that point that, I mean, you would forbid it for Jews also if it was against natural law. And of course, the Jews would respond by saying, well, not only that, but read the Old Testament, guys, although it is forbidden in many cases inside of Israel, though I don't think all, you can certainly charge it to Gentiles. So if Scripture itself allows the charging of interest to Gentiles, then, well, all right, cool. That tells us something. Well, then we're a Gentile church, so, but I won't get ahead of ourselves.
Well, what St. Thomas says about that is that, well, the Old Testament lets them do other things they're not supposed to do too, like divorce, stuff like that. So, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true, right? That you got to look at how exactly these commandments are couched, and then, you know, we're not sola scriptura. We have to understand what the tradition around that is. I think it's actually praised. So, and it seems to be kind of grouped with tribute in some cases, like Solomon is praised for bringing in tribute from all of these other nations. So it seems to be something which is viewed positively. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert on that particular part, but I didn't want to throw it into the discussion.
Okay. Right. And I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that, so in what follows in the paper, I'm assuming for the sake of argument that the basic scholastic theory, basic Thomistic theory is right. I actually think that's not true. I think it's actually wrong. But it's wrong for surprisingly like technical reasons.
Gotcha.
And it's actually a much better argument than you think it is when you first read it. And so I might get into a little bit why I think the argument's wrong, but for the most part, I'm just going to be assuming that it's right.
Okay. And hey, that's a stronger way to go about it too, right? We can just go ahead and grant the argument and then proceed from there. One thing I do want to get on the table, which I heard from you, is that interest and usury, just plain old, are not the same thing, and they have different etymologies. So, yeah, I would just want the listeners to be very clear when we're talking about interest. It doesn't necessarily mean usury. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, so that's important, right? Usury comes from the word usura, which is a Latin term that refers to, like, for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I just assume it means an illegitimate charge on a loan. Interest comes from the word interesse, which is a Latin term which I think originally refers to a penalty for repaying a loan late. But for my purposes here, an interest is a legitimate charge on a loan. Usury is an illegitimate charge on a loan. And I think that distinction tracks a sort of traditional English way of talking about it. George Hayes, a 17th or 18th century Catholic English bishop, or maybe he's Scottish, he writes about this, and he makes the distinction. He tracks it along those two terms. So
Perfect.
For at least what we're doing here, usury is an illegitimate charge on a loan. Interest is a legitimate charge on a loan. So a lot of people get confused because they think they're the same thing, right? And that leads them to think that any charge for a loan is illegitimate. And because we call all charges on a loan, well, because of time, we call them all interests. People get really confused by mixing them together. And I think it's really important that if you're going to understand this stuff, you got to make that distinction. Otherwise, you're going to get mixed up. But,
Right.
It also is, this stuff is incredibly confusing. You have, probably 500 years, like the smartest people on earth arguing about this stuff, and they get really, really, really technical.
They didn't have us, Matt.
Yeah.
They didn't have these goobers on the internet to help them out. But we're here now, dear listeners.
Yeah, not enough weirdos on the internet.
Exactly. You thought there was. You needed 2 more.
Okay.
So what does Aquinas say?
Okay. Well, one more thing before we do that.
Okay. Gotcha.
Another thing that I think is really important to understand is that most people think the church forbade charging for access to credit, and that's not right. So there's the loan, which is the mutuum contract, which in Roman law is a loan of a fungible good for an equal quantity and quality of that same fungible good, right? And so it's included in sort of the Roman definition of what a mutuum is, that you wouldn't charge for it, because it's like your neighbor needs a cup of sugar and they give it to you and they say, okay, but I need a cup of sugar in a couple of days because, right, I have to make a cake. So then you give them a different cup of sugar back. But there's also the census, which develops a little after Aquinas. He doesn't really seem to talk about it very much. And there's debate about what it is. Early on, Henry of Ghent, who's sort of the generation after Aquinas, says the census is usurious because, look, you're making money by doing the functional equivalent of lending. He gets in a lot of trouble for that because the monasteries need the census to function. And so there's debate about what it is, but essentially it's like, I'll pay you $10,000 and you'll pay me back $1,000 a year for 11 years. It can be structured in different ways. Sometimes it was structured so that way you could have a stable income for the rest of your life.
Okay.
Godfrey of Fontaines, who's a student of Aquinas and is important for his sort of intellectualism, he says that it's not usury because what you're doing is you're trading present money for a present right to future money. They're really worried about the time thing.
Okay.
So that's on the table for a little while, but I think that worries them. That starts to look too much like something I would call basically modern loan. What they kind of
sounds like an annuity, right? I mean, if you are basically sending some out and then expecting a bunch of payments, which would include the amount of interest. So that was something pretty common. Only what's his name condemned it?
So Henry of Ghent condemned it. But yeah, it is like an annuity or a bond. Later on, what they settle on is that it's a share of the productivity of a good. So what you see in Juan de Lugo, one of the thinkers I use. So you have a farm, and so by giving you if I give you the $10,000 and you're going to pay me $1,000 a year for 11 years, what I'm doing is I'm buying a share of the productivity of the farm. Now, I think there are problems with that, but that's kind of the solution they settle on later tradition.
And I think if we just took that and that was their critique, hey, you need to be buying, some amount of production into the future. I think most modern economists would be like, that's called a debt stake. You could have an equity or a debt stake. There's different ways to lay claim on future cash flows. Some of them are fixed. Some of them are variable. Some of them are, and we'll get into the triple contract stuff, essentially insured against loss of principal. There's different ways to do this, but sure, it's laying claim on a future cash flow. And that could be in the form of business, like that farm, or it could be in the form of the cash flow that you derive from your own labor. So if somebody wants to buy a farm or buy a house or buy a car, or I guess back then buy a cart, then you could lay claim to a cash flow which is representative of them doing useful things with their labor. And then I don't see a huge difference. So, I mean, if that's really what they're pushing here is the argument, and there are many arguments, and we'll get to them all, I think most modern economists would shrug and be like, yeah, that seems fine. Like, we already would say that our contracts kind of meet that test.
Yeah. So the other kind of contract is a little more complicated that they're willing to allow, at least by the end of the 16th century. It's the triple contract.
All right, cool. Spell out the triple contract. I like this one.
The triple contract is funny because it's so complicated, but actually, I think that by specifying out these different rules, this was able to help them sort of understand what's going on. So the base contract of the triple contract is the societas. And the societas is a contract where sort of I give you capital and you're going to go do business with it. And if you lose it all, you don't have to pay me back anything.
Right. So that's like an equity thing. It's as if you bought like some stock in Busher Enterprises LLC.
Yeah. Some people try to say like that's how Aquinas thinks about it, and I think that's probably anachronistic, but it is like that.
Okay.
So yeah, but if you make a profit, I'm gonna get some of the profit because I provide.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so let's say I give you $1,000, and if you profit, you're gonna give me $100. You're gonna give me $1,100 back. So it's a 10% profit. But then, they say, you could go buy insurance on that $1,000 you initially invested, right? You could give up 4%.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you've secured your capital. And then they say, oh, well, also, you could give up another 3% and guarantee your return.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's it's 3 contracts, an initial investment contract, and then 2 insurance contracts, one to insure the capital, one to insure the return, for a guaranteed 3% return. And then they say, oh, well, you could just do all that with the same person.
Sure.
Right? And then, all right, so there's a lot of debate about this. The Jesuits are actually they're the sort of the last big holdout on this issue. But in 1581, they say, no, it's fine. And also they say, this is interesting, they say, anyone who makes a business contract, even if they don't spell out this really complicated system in their contracts and they just treat it like a loan, we're going to say that there's an implicit intention as long as they intend to contract justly, as long as there's an intention only to profit justly. Actually, that's okay too, right? So implicitly, it is a triple contract, even if it's not structured that way. So by the end of the 16th century, business loan, the functional equivalent of business loans are allowed. So I think it's really important you know that. Otherwise, cool. You're just going to be confused about what's going on for less education.
So everybody seems to be fine with just a partnership where you purchase an equity stake. And then they're saying, you know what, we could just basically, buy a protective put option on one side to guard against loss. We could buy a couple contracts which narrow down what return we'll end up getting, which protect our initial capital. And none of that seems wrong. Nobody's condemning those. So why not put them together? Why not buy them from one person? And then you basically just did a roundabout way of describing a loan.
Okay. The triple contract is controversial. There's a lot of debate about it, but later on, I think everybody took for a handful of holdouts. There've always been a few people who are really, really into this.
Mm-hmm.
And as time has gone on, less and less of the scholastics were sort of willing to take the extreme position.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
So should we move into Aquinas?
Definitely. It's always good to move into Aquinas.
So since this is a paper about later Thomas, up front I have to treat Thomas a little bit, right? Because this is who we're dealing with. And to be clear, I'm not claiming he's inconsistent, because I'm going to go through and I'm going to show some tensions that the later tradition is going to exploit. I'm not claiming he's inconsistent. I think, maybe you can make these consistent. Some of those readings are more plausible than others to me, but it's not really what I'm worried about. So his argument against usury is interesting. So let me read it really fast. So, quote, to take usury for money lent is unjust in itself, because this is to sell what does not exist. And this evidently leads to inequality, which is contrary to justice. In order to make this evident, we must observe that there are certain things the use of which consists in their consumption. Thus, we consume wine when we use it for drink, and we consume wheat when we use it for food. Wherefore, in such like things, the use of the thing must not be reckoned apart from the thing itself, and whoever is granted the use of the thing is granted the thing itself. And for this reason, to lend things of this kind is to transfer the ownership. Accordingly, if a man wanted to sell wine separately from the use of the wine, he would be selling the same thing twice. So he would be selling what does not exist. Wherefore, he would evidently commit a sin of injustice. In like manner, he commits an injustice who lends wine or wheat and asks for double payment. Viz. One, the return of the thing in equal measure, the other, the price of the use, which is called usury. Okay, so the big takeaway here is there are two kinds of things. There are things consumed in their use, and there are things that are not consumed in their use. For things that aren't consumed in their use, you can lend them, charge for the loan, and get the thing back. For things that are consumed in their use, like wine or wheat or money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that track the sort of traditional Roman definition of the mutuum, those things, you can't charge for the thing and for the use of the thing because the use is included in the thing. So this argument's interesting for a few reasons. One, so Aquinas is the first person at Paris to give a natural law argument against usury. Albert and Bonaventure are heading in this direction, right? But he seems to be the first to really make it to make a really strong natural law case for it. Earlier thinkers are just giving circular arguments that belie the definition of the Roman ritual. I think that the way to understand this argument is it's an attempt to argue that the Roman mutuum is the natural kind of loan. Because, if it turns out that there are other kinds of loans, right? So there's the mutuum and there's other kind of loan that you charge for, then you wouldn't actually show that charging for a loan is wrong, because you just say, oh, well, this contract isn't a mutuum, it's this other kind of loan. And
Right.
people will you'll still see people kind of make that mistake in their arguments.
Right. So the mistake, just to be clear, is there's a type of loan in Roman law which prohibited the charging of interest. So you look back and go, oh, look at this. They're prohibiting interest on loans, but a mutuum is not all loans. It's a type of loans. There are other type of loans, like the census, for instance, which would allow the charging of interest.
Well, no. So the census is not a loan. I think it's
okay, census not a loan. Okay.
I think
sure looks like a loan, but not a loan.
It looks like a loan to moderns, to the medieval.
Sure. They're sure that's not even a loan.
They don't even think about it like it's a loan.
That's hilarious, because we would look at that and be like, that you're describing a classic like bond with a coupon payment. Like, yep.
Yeah. So, but I think that what's important to understand about this argument here, I think, is that he's trying to argue that the mutuum is what a loan is by nature, right?
Okay, gotcha.
And there's an implicit assumption here that's really important that you can kind of miss it. There's an implicit assumption that 2 units of a thing are always of equal value, right? So a pound of flour and another pound of flour, if they're of equal quality, they're equal in value. So they should only exchange one for another, right? He's relying on a principle in Aristotle's Ethics, right? Which is that for commutative justice, there has to be equality in exchange. Aristotle gives examples where you can't trade shoes for houses because the equality is hard to find, so we use money as sort of measure of equality. But they're actually looser about that, and so people get too worried about it sometimes when they read Aquinas on just price theory. But what's important here is that this equality part opens up the possibility of charging for expenses, right? Lugo says, quote, one does not commit usury unless something is given or received as the price of the loan, or is something owed from justice. Okay? So, because there has to be equality in the exchange, right? They're assuming 2 units of the same thing are always equal. And, sorry, I lost my train of thought. They're assuming 2 units of the same thing are always equal.
Okay.
But if sort of loaning out harms you in a special way, then you can charge not only for the thing, but for the harm. that assumption of equality, that's one of the areas that I think they're wrong. Cardinal Rowe, though, he actually gives a pretty good argument for this, and you especially see this in sort of later scholastics. So Gerardo of Siena gives an argument against usury that explicitly relies on this principle, and actually it's interesting because he ends up rejecting Aquinas' argument and saying like, yeah, Aquinas' argument is okay, but it's sort of accidental. He's not really tracking the real thing, which is equality between units of the same good. And I think Gerardo of Siena's argument's a lot better. But one of the reasons I get off the train, one of the reasons I think they're wrong is that I think this equality of value is quite wrong, because I think it's incompatible with sort of assumptions of receiving action theory that the value of a means is imputed from the end. But there are pretty good arguments for it. Cardinal Van Rohe gives a pretty good argument for it, but it's not always wrong. So
that makes it. Yeah, I would probably reject that also, because I don't think that we exchange things based on the objective value of the thing. I think we exchange it based on the subjective value to the person who's going to use the thing and interact with the thing. I would care a lot about a glass of water if I was in the desert, not because of the objective value of a bottle of water, but because I'm thirsty. So that's first thing I would reject. But even if we just go ahead and grant that, and whatever, we'll grant that, he still seems to be very wrong. Like I mean, two examples. One is like he would think there's an equality, there's a justice if we trade two fungible things at different times. Well, if I go into my neighbor's house and I take all of their food out of their fridge and out of their cabinets, and I take everything out and I remove it all and I bring it back in 1 year, have I harmed them? Yeah, right? Like, certainly have. And then another example is, so the food today and the food for a year from now, being without it for a year does matter. And likewise, the idea that a loan of $100 and $100 in cash today are equivalent is flat out false. And it's just factually false, because go ahead and try to sell a $100 loan repayable in 5 years at 0% interest. I promise you, it is not worth $100. Not a single person on earth would purchase that loan for $100. They would discount it based on the risk-free rate of return over the 5 years and then pay you accordingly. So it might work out to, I don't know, $80. So it's not true that a $100 loan is equal to $100. So even if we hold constant the money for money, I think that when you include time and you include the fact that one is cash and one is a loan, then Aquinas' own argument doesn't seem to work.
Well, so what they're going to say about that, the later ones, is they're going to say all that stuff is per accidens, right? The per se value is the same, but they're willing to allow fluctuations in value according to per accidens conditions. So I guess I should define what those terms mean. So the thing in itself, they're going to say, yeah, that's still equal in value, right? The food now, the food in a year, right?
Sure.
But these sort of outside conditions that affect how you desire the thing, those can affect the value, and they're willing to grant that, right? Totally. That's the thing that's going to be really important. So let me introduce
it's an accidental quality of it. To me, I'd be like, okay, go with me on this one. I have 2 horses. Both share in horse nature. Both have value as a horse. But there's an accidental quality of one having no legs. Does this change their value, Aquinas? Does it? Well, it's not an accident. Well, it's only an accidental change. Right. But that matters a lot.
But I mean, so 2 things. So one, they're all aware of that, right? Aquinas talks about it.
Right.
And 2, well, the horse with no legs and the horse with legs aren't fungible, right? You can't substitute them.
Okay, and neither are loans and cash.
So, well, yeah. So that's like, just hang on to that, because
okay. Getting carried away.
So remember I said a minute ago that there has to be equality in exchange, right?
Okay.
So that means that if loaning something to you harms me in some way, that means according to justice, you have to compensate me for the harm it caused.
Sure.
Okay. In order to maintain the equality, right?
Okay.
And so these are extrinsic titles. And extrinsic titles are charges for a loan that aren't usury because they're not charges for the loan itself, right? So there are two that are really important. There are others that are, there are a ton of them, but there are two that are really important for what I'm doing here. The first is the damnum emergens, which is sort of emergent damage, right? It's an expense caused by delayed. Originally, it's an expense caused by delayed payment, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So if I lend you $1,000 and I say, okay, or I need this $1,000 back before my mortgage is due, or else I'm going to have to pay these fees, and you don't pay me back in time, I can justly charge you for the fees I have to pay. That way, the equality is maintained.
Okay.
Right? And so there's the next important one, which is kind of, you need to think about it as a version of damnum emergens. It's lucrum cessans, as it's foregone profit.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm giving up profit, like I was going to invest, but because I have to lend you money for something else, I can't invest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm giving up a certain amount of profit, right? And so what they decide later on is that, and there's a little bit of this, what they decide later on is that I can charge you for what I gave up, the profit. I can charge you the value of the profit I gave up as well. So the opportunity cost is what I can charge you for. And there's a little bit of precedent on this in Aquinas. Sort of in his just price theory, he allows you to charge more for a good than he allows you to charge more than the market price for a good, even though the market price is ordinarily the just price. If giving up that good will harm you in some way, like this is something you really need, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if there's something I really need, but you need it more, you can buy it from me, but I can charge you for the damage that giving it up will do to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a case that they talk about. I don't think Aquinas talks about it, but Scotus talks about it, and it's taken from a decretum of Gregory IX, Naviganti, I think. Is that if you lend wheat in spring to be repaid in the fall, no, wait, that's not. So if
we're not farmers, guys. Don't take any farming advice from me or Matt. Mm-mm.
we're off our game today.
Yeah.
But if I'm holding wheat if I'm holding wheat, I'm going to charge for it when the price goes up. You really need it now for some reason, then according to Scotus, and I think according to Aquinas, based on the just price principles he lays out, I can charge you the higher price, right?
Okay.
And this is sort of a standard medieval canon law, I'd say. Okay. Now, so let's go through Aquinas on the extrinsic titles I pointed earlier, right?
All right.
So,
let's hear these.
So first on damnum emergens, in De Malo, he's really strict about it, right? So he says, quote, a lender by reason of money lent can in two ways incur the loss of something already possessed. The lender incurs loss in one way because the borrower does not return the money lent at the specified date, and then the borrower is obliged to pay compensation. The lender incurs loss in a second way when the borrower returns the money lent within a specified time, and then the borrower is not obliged to pay compensation, since the lender ought to have taken precautions against loss to self, and the borrower ought not incur loss regarding the lender's stupidity. And it is similar regarding buying, for the buyer of something justly pays for it as much as it is worth, and not as much as the seller is hurt by its privation. So here he's pretty strict, although he's not as strict as other thinkers of the time, like Peter Cantor, who's a theologian. He thinks any charges on a loan at all are, even if sort of I've been really, really harmed because you didn't pay me back in time, he thinks that's usury. But Aquinas, he was following Albert the Great, and he's allowing so in the mortgage case I gave earlier, right? If I'm harmed by you not paying me back in time, then I can charge you the harm, right? But Aquinas' position here is still really strong, right? So you can imagine a medical case to sort of show how really radical this position is. Right? So if I need a surgery and my condition is deteriorating such that in a year my surgery is going to be a lot more expensive than it is today, and I have the money, but you need a surgery that you can't afford. You're not going to be able to afford it for another year. But if you don't have it, you're going to die within 6 months. Then, according to if I lend you the money for your surgery on the condition you pay me back next year for the amount my surgery costs, right? Aquinas' position is that that's usury.
That's nuts.
Yeah, so I don't think he has examples like this in mind. Later thinkers in the tradition come up with examples like this. Juan de Lugo comes up with an example like this. Right? But that's a really, really strong position, right? Now, if I've already scheduled the surgery and so there's a fine for cancellation, right? Then I could charge you that. Aquinas would be okay with that. But I can't charge you the added expense that lending causes me because it's indirect. Right. So that's pretty radical. You gotta be a true believer in this.
Right. And that doesn't, and as we pointed out earlier, this is the most strict point in church history that the church has been on usury, is around this time. Before then, they seem to be more lax. Certainly now they're like, nah, you're fine.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to say the church. I would just want to say the religion. Right. So, but in the Summa, he's a little less. In the Summa, the position's a little less strict.
Okay.
So in the Summa, he says, quote, a lender may without sin enter an agreement with the borrower for compensation for the loss he incurs of something he ought to have. For this is not to sell the use of money, but to avoid a loss. It may also happen that the borrower avoids a greater loss than the lender incurs, wherefore the borrower may repay the lender with what he had gained. So this text is controversial. There's debate about how these two texts are consistent. I don't want to say there's a contradiction here. But what's really important is that it makes a connection between usury and just price theory. So, because while normally the value of a thing is its fair market value, if something holds a special value to the seller, as I already outlined, it deserves to be indemnified from the loss that sale brings to him. So that connection is really important, and later scholastics are gonna grab onto that, and it's gonna be significant for what they do.
And that's just a big deal. It's common sense too. Like, I don't know, what kind of car do you drive, Matt?
An old Camry.
An old Camry. All right. Let's say it's worth, I don't know, $10,000 in the market price. You could look on cars.com. Yeah, it's about 10 grand. If somebody comes up and says, hey, I noticed you're in the parking lot. I want to buy your Camry. The just price is $10,000. Here's $10,000. You're going to go, no, I need to drive to work. Like, I'm going to have to look for a new car. Like, no. Like, it's just not just that they should be able to roll up with the market price and just demand that you say, yes, I will sell it to you. No, because you're not in the market. You have a higher reserve price, and you have a reserve price over the market price, as evidenced by the fact that you didn't put it on the market. So if you're going to ask somebody to make that transaction, it's not fair that you charge the market price. It's only fair that you actually give them their reserve price, what they're going to let it go for, because it's probably going to reflect real costs on you in having to scramble to find a car tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's the position he endorses in his just price theory. But I think that the assumption that 2 units of a good are always equal in value is really important.
Okay, cool.
But let's move on to lucrum cessans. So when Aquinas treats lucrum cessans clearly, when he treats it directly, he clearly rejects it. He says, quote, the lender cannot enter an agreement for compensation with the fact that he makes no profit out of his money, because he must not sell that which he has not yet, and may be prevented in many ways from having. End quote. Right. So you can't charge for profit because you don't have it yet, and you might not have it. Right. He says may be prevented in many ways from having. Right. Even though in the just price case, right, like the case of the wheat seller, right, the wheat might spoil or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but slightly earlier in the Summa, though, he seems to allow something like lucrum cessans. He gives a case where someone who has stolen seeds planted in a field, or someone who fails to pay back his creditor on time. He says, quote, now a man suffers a loss in 2 ways. First, by being deprived of what he actually has. And a loss of this kind is always to be made good by repayment. For instance, if a man indemnifies another by destroying his house, he is bound to name the value of the house. Second, a man may damnify another by preventing him from obtaining what he is on the way to obtain. A loss of this kind need not be made good and equivalent, because to have a thing virtually is less than to have it actually. And to be on the way to obtain a thing is to have it merely virtually or potentially. And so, were he to be indemnified by receiving the thing actually, he would be paid not the exact value taken from him, but more. And this is not necessary for equality as stated above. However, he is bound to make some compensation according to the condition of persons and things. So in these cases, even though someone has planted seeds in a field and they may be prevented from having their harvest in many ways, and they don't yet have it actually, and someone has lost profit because someone hasn't paid a loan back in time, right? Then you can charge something like group interest.
Mm-hmm.
So the point here, right, is that the principles in Aquinas are there, right, for later scholastics to take and develop into a fuller doctrine. But Aquinas himself doesn't really allow these things.
Okay.
So
that does seem like a bit of a tension with what he said earlier.
Yeah, I don't want to say it's an inconsistency, but I think there's a tension.
You know, one thing I kind of want to put out there is a lot of these rules that they're kind of getting at are ones, even the strict ones, are ones which I would probably abide by if my neighbor came, or if my like a cousin or somebody came up for a loan. I wouldn't really charge them any interest, right? Because, well, a benefit to them is like a benefit to me. You know, Aristotle would say that a friend is a second self. So if they benefit from what would have been interest versus me benefiting from charging interest, there's just no real difference. So amongst friends, it doesn't make sense to charge interest. And amongst friends, it would make sense to be like, hey man, I have a surgery and my leg is going gangrenous over here and is only getting worse. Friends would say, oh, then I'll kick in some extra cash so you can get your surgery after. So a lot of what seems to be sketched out here are rules which make sense amongst like a close-knit community, members of your church, friends, etc. And in their context, this is like people living in a medieval town for the last 1,000 years. Everybody is related to everybody. Everybody is friends. You're all one tight-knit culture. And that is kind of like an inter-friend, inter-community operation that the majority of their loans are operating within. So it's almost like it's inside of like a family, community, friend structure. When we move out of that into the public sphere, into the economic sphere, whereby we're dealing with random people, we're allowing capital to flow here and there for uses that we don't actually know necessarily, and we're responding to prices and not just people. Things are different. And we already have the biblical principle of exactly what I said, that inside of Israel, with the people that you know, you're related to, you understand, this is an friends and family operation. It is not a public economic operation. And these two have different teloses. These two have different ends, if you will. So therefore, we have different rules which apply to them. And that seems reasonable. I would take all of the strict stuff and apply it in my own life to a friend who is offered a loan. However, I'm not going to treat the global economy as everybody's my cousin necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that in the context they're operating in, there's no real economic growth. Trade is starting to develop, but there's really not that much inter-regional trade. So everything, these communities are very close, tight, and it's as trade develops more and more in the later Middle Ages and people get more and more prosperous that they become more and more permissive, because I think they start to think more and more about how all this stuff works.
Right.
And, I mean, what's interesting is that a lot of economists think that sort of the development of modern capitalism, it comes out of the church's marriage laws. So if you can't marry your first cousin and you live in a medieval village of like 50 people, right? Your marriage options are pretty limited.
Sure.
Right. So you gotta go elsewhere, right? So that starts to build trust and sort of relationships across these towns.
Interesting.
So once you trust people, it makes sense to start engaging in trade with them.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
and you're a philosophy of biology guy, and so I'll give a biology example. I'm sure I've given before in other episodes, and that is there's a distinction between active transport and diffusion. And when you're at a really small scale, like a single cell organism, or even like a simple multi-cell organism, or even inside of your own like body systems, like sections of your liver, you don't require active transport of key resources. Why? Because they diffuse across the concentration gradient, and that is actually a super low cost way of moving things to their best use. The problem is it doesn't scale. Yeah. So what I was talking about earlier was not screw the people you don't know, prefer the guys you do know. That's wrong. Everybody is your neighbor. Jesus made this very clear. Love your neighbor as yourself. Everybody's your neighbor. So your action of love and preferring one another is just universal, full stop. But the means by which we transfer resources at a small and a large scale is necessarily different, just like in a body, just like in a state, where if it's me and a couple people in a town, why put in any active transport, i.e. the price system? We can just allow, if I have an extra shovel, you need a shovel, it goes to you, and vice versa. So once we start expanding this through trade, and interestingly, apparently through marriage, then we reach a scale where diffusion is no longer possible, where people do not benefit from just relying on this, and we require active transport. We require a more complicated system, and one like, blood pumping through your body, or trade routes which carry resources, and then we have information passed through price signals. And this is good, and it actually benefits it benefits the whole to have that more complicated, though more costly system in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's right, and I think it's important, and I think people fail to realize that. So should we move on to the later Thomists?
Of course, we should move on to the later Thomists.
Okay, so there are two important traditions between the earlier medieval tradition that Aquinas is in and the later medieval tradition. There are two important changes that I think people should be aware.
But actually, before we hit that, can we just kind of recap? You said that there's a few extrinsic titles. Can we kind of go through which extrinsic titles? So like claims on money over and above the initial value of the loan. Which ones do we have so far on the table?
So the two I outlined earlier, and really the only two I need, what I'm doing here, are the damnum emergens, a charge for sort of damage that comes to as a result of the loan, and lucrum cessant, which you can think about as foregone profit, which is a version of damnum emergens, because not being able to profit is a kind of being damaged.
Right. Okay. And
there are others. They're like, I don't know. In the people I've read, there are lots and lots of them, but those are really the only two reading.
Perfect. And those two categories by themselves, now that we kind of spell them out, I mean, listeners can imagine all of the traditional reasons one charges interest fitting into those. Like we say, well, there's going to be inflation of 3% over the next 5 years. Well, that would be a loss, right? Okay, cool. Well, the first one, you're having a loss, you could be justly compensated.
Well, inflation's interesting. Let's come back to that at the end.
Okay, cool. We'll hit that later. But certainly we have opportunity cost. I guess you could say that the lack of liquidity could lead to damages. People have a liquidity preference, and they'll pay for that. So if you remove their ability to have liquidity, that seems to be a loss to them.
Yeah. Well, there's debate about stuff like that, but later on we'll see. You'll see. Just hang on.
Okay, cool.
There's something like that going on.
But there we go. So we got the big categories of extrinsic titles. Later Thomists coming up. What do we have, Matt?
Okay, so there are two important changes I think people need to be aware of. So the earlier medieval tradition that St. Thomas is part of, they tend to be very suspicious of contracts that even loosely resemble the mutuum. Right, and as a result, they tend to assume there's usury going on anytime sort of there's something. It just feels a little funny to them. It's like early on, they think exchanging one kind of money for another is probably usury, and then as Europe sort of expands, and there are more and more kinds of money going on, they realize that no, it's actually really important. It's okay. They're still concerned that usury might be being hidden in those transactions, but the transactions themselves are okay in principle. But by the 16th century, their scholastics, there's a lot more trade going on. They have a much better understanding of trade. And so they're a lot more generous. And there's just sort of there's a bias in favor of interpreting the contracts to be different, to be something other than a mutuum. So early on, they tend to reduce everything to the mutuum. Later they say, well, that's probably not a mutuum. Although they still think usury is a problem. They're still very worried about it. They're also, the later scholastics, they're bothered by sort of the piecemeal theory, the piecemeal nature of the old theory. Like the old theory, the sort of earlier medieval theory, it's got a whole bunch of parts that don't quite fit together, and it works. It's functional for the sort of high medieval economy, but it's not really functional anymore by the 16th century. And so the later scholastics, they want something really systematic. They want to sort of iron out the inconsistencies that the earlier theory led to. This is also sort of an era of great systematizers, right? Think of Francisco Suarez's Disputatio Metaphysicae, which is this huge work, right? It's just the systematic approach to metaphysics that you don't really see in earlier thinkers. Right? Aquinas is more systematic because the Summa proceeds logically, but you got to realize people think Aquinas is like the paradigm of the medieval, and he's a weirdo because he actually writes stuff. The rest of them don't really write stuff. He proceeds sort of like, most of the time what they're doing is they're writing commentaries, right? So commentaries on the sentences, commentaries on Aristotle, and that's how most of the tradition works. Aquinas writes his own stuff, and so people think that's how it works, but it's just not until later. Later on, they do. Okay, so going back to lucrum cessans, there are three conditions given by Cardinal Ilugo for what needs to happen so you can charge the lucrum cessans. So the first is that the loan be the true cause of foregone profit, but that is that profit is forgone by you because you give in lending and will not cease for other reasons. So the loan has to be the reason you're not profiting. Like it can't be that you're not profiting and you lend money, right? The loan has to be the cause of the opportunity cost. And so two, but then nothing be demanded beyond the principal of the loan, except as much as the profit foregone is able to be valued. So you can only charge the value of the profit you're giving up. You can't charge more than that. Okay, so you can only charge what the opportunity cost is. And three, that the money given as reimbursement not be given immediately by the borrower, but later. So I can't lend you $1,000 and say, you have to give me $100 I'm giving up right now, because that's only to lend you $900, right? It has to be paid at the end. Okay. Now, the kind of intention you need to charge lucrum cessans is a tough problem, right? And they go back and forth about this a lot. But the mere possibility of making money that's not enough, right? So you can imagine a person who thinks to himself, I'm either going to lend my money out and charge for it, or I'm going to lock it in a box, right? Mm-hmm. That person can't charge lucrum cessans because they're not actually giving anything up by lending it out. You also don't need, sometimes people construe the intention needed as an absolute intention to invest. Like you need the contract in your hands but unsigned. And that's not right either. So Cardinal Van Rohe, he gives a sort of nice summary of the intention you need. So he says, quote, now when I, at any rate, hand over money, I want to make a profit from my money. However, I'm able, if I want, to make a profit from many productive contracts. Indeed, there are inconveniences in these contracts. Consider the effort, the uncertainty of profit, the dangers of loss, which, although they are to be feared, I may nevertheless want to undertake if they might be brought to adjust the acquired profit. But at the same time, an opportunity for lending money is available to me. Although these two possibilities are available to me, I simply prefer to offer the money by a loan with the title of lucrum cessans. So the idea there is that there could be real money-making opportunities available, right? So in the early Middle Ages, there aren't those opportunities available, and it's going to be important. We're going to come back to that. Well, there aren't very many of those opportunities. There are some. Two, I have a desire to invest my money profitably in something other than lending. You don't have to have concrete plans, right? So you can think about this as sort of your desires are such that if the opportunity were presented, you would take it. And three, a loan contract is available and you choose the loan contract instead of the business contract you might choose if you were presented with a similar opportunity. So let's go through 3 examples that I think might be helpful. So the first one is someone who's definitively set aside money to invest. Right? They say, okay, I've got $10,000. I'm going to invest it. They just haven't decided on the particular venture. Mm-hmm. And then they decide to lend it out instead. They can charge lucrum cessans at the morally certain rate of profit, right? Because this is what we would expect them to receive if they didn't lend, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep. Okay.
Now, so 2, consider someone who's only considering whether he should invest, but instead lends his money. You can't say here that lending the money has deprived him of profit he's morally certain that he's going to have, right? Because he hasn't actually decided if he's going to. But according to St. Alphonsus and Lugo, you can still charge an extrinsic title for 2 reasons. One, the probability that he will invest, like if it's 70% likely that he's going to invest or 30% likely that he's going to invest, that's priceable, right? And so since he's giving that up, he needs to be compensated for it. And that's not the simple potential to invest, right? That's not just like sort of having the abstract ability out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's different. So 2, the faculty of being able to decide to invest is also worth something, right? So St. Alphonsus gives this example. It's, quote, as if someone was in a difficulty about whether they were able or wanted to fish tomorrow. They would probably be able to require some kind of payment if they obligated themselves not to fish for your benefit. Okay, so someone they're trying to decide if they're going to fish tomorrow, but being able to decide whether or not they're going to go fish tomorrow is worth something, right?
Right.
And so
totally optionality. Yep.
So if they give that up, then you need to compensate them for it.
Sure.
Right? So similarly, in the investment case.
Okay.
Right. Now the third case, and I think this is the one that people who are sort of usury hawks, I think they might find this really outrageous. Someone who thinks to themselves, quote, I wish to do commerce except for the many seeking loans. Okay. So this person is essentially a professional lender, right? They have no plans to invest in something other than lending, and they might even make their living entirely from lending. However, if they couldn't make money by lending, they would be doing licit business with the money. So therefore, it's true that lending is why they are not profiting through ordinary business. Right? So remember, one of Cardinal Lugo's conditions is lending. The loan has to be the true cause of not profit.
Mm-hmm.
So thus they can claim lucrum cessans, right?
I love this, that like this would make some of the, I like that you coined usury hawks, pull their hair out. The idea that we could have a professional lender in the business of lending, charging interest on loans, and he has a just title that he can claim as per St. Alphonsus, who is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, moral theologian in the history of the church.
Yeah, and actually when we go through the objections I answer, there's someone who says, well, you would never think this. But I mean, I don't think he's read all of Newton's book, right? Because clearly the later scholastics think this. So let's look at a quote from St. Alphonsus, right? Quote, but you say this person commits usury, a professional lender, because he has an efficacious will to profit from a loan and an inefficacious will to profit from commerce. But to this it is possible to respond, although he has an inefficacious will for commerce, nevertheless this person has an efficacious will to profit justly. And because it is already possible for him to justly profit from commerce, therefore he justly profits from the loan. Since the loan is here, the true and effective cause is foregone profit from commerce. Right? So you can have there's a similar quote from one of the Lugo that might be worth going through. Quote, but if someone prefers money made from lending, not because he values profit given by a borrower more than what is hoped for from commerce, but because this mode of profiting is more in accord with his taste and inborn talents, and he avoids some other troubles, which nevertheless he would not redeem for a price, but he prefers to earn a greater profit with these troubles than to earn less without them, then I think this view might be truly affirmed. For just as an artisan who would not wish to buy leisure from work at some price, but prefers his entire profit with labor rather than less without it, is able to demand his entire profit from him who invites him to recreation. even though he truly prefers to have his entire profit without labor and with recreation and with favor. And so even someone who prefers lending because they're more talented at it or they have better connections, and they justly can charge whatever they're giving up by lending instead of doing something else, right? And it's important that the market equilibrates these things, right? Like, so if you're making more in one industry than in another industry, those gains are arbitrated away by the process of the
100%.
market. Right? So in this case, right, the market itself contains mechanisms that are going to make sure that someone who makes their money by lending is not making more in another avenue.
So let's how about I go on a few diatribes? We take a brief break. We talk about a little bit of the shift that comes out a little bit later, and then we dig into some of the, I guess we hit Cardinal Rowe, a couple objections, further objections, and boom, that's a podcast. But the first thing is, you've gone through a whole bunch here. First one is there have to be money-making opportunities available. And here in this wonderful modern economy, you have the ability to get a high-yield savings account, right? Like everybody can do that and make, 4 or 5% or something. So everybody has that. If you choose not to put your money in a savings account, maybe because it takes a day or so to clear and you think you might have an impending purchase or whatever reason, well then, given the fact that you could certainly do that and you've chosen not to, shows that you value more the liquidity than you value that interest, which means to take away that is for you to suffer loss in excess to what you would have received in interest, since you have demonstrated by your actions you prefer this liquidity to the quantity of interest. So you could actually, in this case, if you don't have it in that savings account, if anything, charge an even higher title. And then with it in the savings account, just the prevalence of these would, by their definition, allow you to claim that title. I think it's interesting. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Savings accounts, right? So people might think, oh, well, no, that doesn't work because savings accounts pay interest, and that's usury. But so when Cardinal Rowe talks about this, he just says it's not a mutuum. It's the way to think about savings accounts is a mutuum includes time. That's why you're not allowed to charge for time. It's included in the concept. But a bank account, right? There's no time included in the concept of what a bank account is, right? Any time that they're going to maintain the money after you withdraw it, right? That's purely incidental. It's like due to processing and stuff, right? So it's not a mutuum. So the way to think about it is the interest that they pay is a free gift that they pay in order to obtain the benefit from you depositing your money there. So for Cardinal Rowe, right, the existence of high yield savings accounts means there's automatically this right to charge the quintessence, assuming you have an intention to profit justly, right? That's not. So, and there's no usury problem with those accounts.
Okay, so there's no usury problem with the accounts for what I take as a bit of a weird reason, because underneath the hood of this, the bank is absolutely doing time-based loans. They're just grabbing a large amount of these, holding enough liquidity to pay anybody who wants to withdraw from their savings account, and then splitting the interest.
We'll talk about the loans. We'll talk about the bank loans in a little bit.
All right, let's pause right there.
Okay.
We are back. So there was a shift from Lugo and Alphonsus to now. What was it? How did it happen? Fill us in on the deets in case some people didn't read a bazillion books on this.
So like I said, something changes. There's a shift. Like I said, there's a shift between the early and sort of the late medieval period, and there's another shift later on. There's another shift more recently between Lugo, who's writing in the 17th century, and Alphonsus, who's writing in the 18th century, right? And like I said earlier, this is where it was noticing this discontinuity, although I hadn't read Lugo and Alphonsus on this yet. It was noticing that there was discontinuity that got me interested in writing this paper. Is that so Lugo and Alphonsus, they're both relatively permissive. Like Cardinal Lowy would say they're generous about granting extrinsic titles, right? But they're still worried that usury is happening, and they're still like, they still think confessors like kind of need to be going over the contracts people in confession have. And then, like, when you read in sort of 19th century manualists or 19th, 20th century, like Dominic Prumer, or if you read Noah Schmidt's manual, or some of the other ones, Rickaby's got a good one. Their view is that there's no real practical difficulty for the confessor here. And they just say, like, they would give the traditional view, but they'll just say, don't worry about it. And one of the things that changes is in the 1830s, the Vatican starts issues, I think, 3 decrees, essentially where priests have written to the Vatican saying, I have this person who I think might be considering committing this in a usury. What do you think? And the Vatican says, don't bother them. Non esse inquietandos, right? So, but the people have to they say, okay, they seem to say, okay, well, we're going to rule on this later, but as long as the penitent promises to abide by whatever we decide later, if we decide something later, then, tell them not to worry about what they're doing.
Okay.
And then essentially after the 1830s, the Vatican just stops talking about this. You do get references to usury, like Leo XIII is a reference to it. Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. Like, they'll mention it, but they'll never really say what it means, and the meaning seems to have shifted. Okay, so we need to understand what the shift is. And I think someone who's really helpful for understanding what the shift is Cardinal Joseph Ernst van Rooyen. I mentioned earlier. So he wrote a dissertation in 1903 at Louvain, where he's arguing that we, traditional Thomists, can accommodate this change in approach from the church within the traditional scholastic theory of money. There's sort of a wave of people abandoning the traditional scholastic theory of money, usury, because of the Vatican's new declaration. But Van Rooyen is saying, no, we can fit it in. We can make it work.
Okay.
And he actually enlists economists like Jürgen von Bamberg, the famous in amazing ways Austrian economist, right? And he says, like, these guys are on the scholastic side. And while I still think Cardinal Rooyen's wrong, I think he's actually got a really interesting point there. And actually, sort of the more traditional Austrian view that you see espoused by Bamberg, other thinkers, is actually pretty close to the scholastic view. And there are really interesting questions you can ask about the influence of Aristotle and Karl Menger that might explain it. So that's a whole other thing.
It's a different podcast.
Yeah. So what Cardinal Rooyen is arguing is that there's a universal de facto presumption in favor of concessions. Right. So it's not that everybody actually has it, but it's that everyone has a presumption in favor of it, right? So, and the key to understanding this is to remind me that one of Cardinal de Lugo's conditions for claiming the concessions is that the act of lending must be the cause of not profiting, right? Now, in the medieval world or in the early modern world, when sort of the earlier thinkers are writing, there are a lot fewer opportunities to profit. So it makes sense that if someone is going to charge for foregone profit, they're going to have to provide, like, proof. Like, one of the things De Lugo and Alphonsus Usury recommend is they say, so if you as a confessor have cases where you're not sure you're not sure they're charging the correct amount, go ask other merchants who are doing similar things, like highly regarded people in the community. Ask them what would you expect to earn on this return.
Interesting. So they're actually appealing to the market price and understanding that as what the just price is. That's pretty interesting. I like that.
That's how I get it. St. Albert the Great says that. He says the market price is the price.
Okay, it's good. We need shirts. Like, this is going to be the first Cutting the Gordian Knot merch. The market price is the just price.
Yeah. But so I mean, this is a tangent, but it's probably worth going off on. But when people read St. Thomas on just price theory, they misunderstand him, because just price theory in Aquinas is supposed to apply in exceptional circumstances, right? ordinarily when the market's more or less working and the traditional price and there are alternative vendors, right? If someone's charging more, you just go to the other vendor. Like if
Sure.
you go to the grocery store and flour is twice as much as it is at the other grocery store, you just go to the other grocery store.
Right.
And so and they understand that. But when the market's not working properly, which happens a lot in the medieval world, a world where transportation is very difficult, a world where like crop blights really wipe out, large portions of the harvest, a world where information moves really weirdly, a world where certain people have more access to currency so they can charge monopolistic prices, right? That's when just price theory is supposed to kick in. And one of the ways you know this is, right, so John Duns Scotus uses this word for people who are cheating, this French word for people who are cheating in his discussion of just price theory. And so, like, one of the things that would happen is if you would have a medieval city with a wall, right, it's only got one or two gates, right? If one of the things you can do, if you wanted to charge them, if you wanted to sort of make an easy buck and you had access to money, right, you could stand outside the city gates and buy all the wheat that was coming into the market.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could go into the market and charge a monopolistic price, right? I think that's really the kind of thing Aquinas is targeting when he's talking about just price theory. And that's why the merchant can charge for how much for his labor and what he's giving up, right? And I think that's why in the De Malo quote, he says, well, the merchant doesn't charge as much as he's harmed. You charge what the price is, right? Because in the De Malo citation I gave earlier, he's assuming the market's working. And in the Summa, when he's talking about just price theory, he's not.
Oh, that's a good way to synthesize those two.
If you're a medieval like theologian, you understand this, right? Because like this is just the world you live. But if you live in 2024 and you're just some Catholic guy who cares about justice and following church teaching, like things you should care about, and you read Aquinas on this stuff, there's a good chance you're not going to pick it up.
Right. And, we have a word for this economically, and we typically just call that those are rents, right? It's an amount that you extract because of some type of maybe legal privilege or because you somehow secured a monopoly, which is normally also some type of legal privilege. And it goes over and above what the natural point of market equilibrium would have been or was prior. And we say that that's an unjust amount, right? But not because it's usury. We would say it's just flexing your political or other type of power, monopolistic power, in order to extract more. So you're basically dropping down the consumer surplus and massively boosting your producer surplus in a way which isn't checked by competition and therefore isn't reflective of what the market price, which would be. And recall, the market price is the just price. So I think modern economists would just call what they're trying to get at something else. They would call it extraction of rents.
Yeah. You might qualify the market price as the just price by saying like market price, parentheses, assuming everything's functioning correctly.
Sure. Assuming easy, unrestricted access into the market by buyers and sellers.
Right.
Yeah. So
I think when people hear the market price is the just price, they think any price you can charge is the just price. And that's not what they mean. And that's not really even what the phrase market price. People get confused. Okay, so should we go back to Ellen?
Sure.
Okay, so where was I? Let me just go back a little bit. So Rowe argues there's this universal de facto presumption in favor of lucrum and the key to understanding this is to remember that one of de Lugo's conditions to claim lucrum is that the act of lending has to be the cause of not profiting. Like I said, in a world where profit opportunities are rare, that's going to be harder than in a world like the modern world with tons of profit opportunities. And this is the point Rowe sort of hammers on. Right? The modern economy just offers much greater opportunities to invest in earlier economies. So we could be morally certain, and that morally certain is different than epistemically certain. Such opportunities are always available. So this is a good quote, so I'm going to read it. So Rowe says, This, the correct notion of lucrumescens being properly seen, contributes much to explaining the present-day universal practice of profiting by credit. From the first place, because of the intensity of economic life, because of the great ease in circulating goods, even immobile ones, because of the marvelous communication between all the regions of the world, reasonable doubt scarcely still exists about the possibility for everyone, at home and abroad, to apply money by some way for commerce. Hence, a general probability of profiting from money is able to be preserved in such a way that it is truly presumed by common estimation. Therefore, if at the same time an efficacious will is presupposed for profiting justly from money, by that very fact, in any loan of money, the title of lucrumescens is properly preserved. Therefore, it is not at all necessary now that lucrumescens be provided in a singular case, nor is it necessary that there be express stipulation about the same. Okay, so what I really like about this quote is that you can kind of see the wonder in it about how marvelous the world over 100 years ago is for its communication and the transport of goods and exchange, right? How intense economic life is, right? And also important, right, is that in the old case they require that a sort of lucrumescens be explicitly stipulated, and that it had to be proved, right? But in the modern world, that doesn't make sense anymore because it always exists. You can always presume the lender wants to charge, and you no longer have to prove the cases, right? So the point here, the really important point, is that using the traditional scholastic theory, as found in Aquinas, developed in later thinkers like De Lugo and August Ligori, Cardinal Rowe has shown how anyone with the intention to profit justly with their money qualifies for lucrumescens, right? And remember that the standard for an intention to profit justly is it's relatively low, right? It's not that you have to have this super sophisticated business plan that you're going to profit justly with. You just have to be such that you would take just opportunities. Now, you can't be the kind of person who would take unjust opportunities, right? Like the guy who would be lending his money or engaged in human trafficking, like that guy can't charge lucrumescens because
but he's got bigger fish to fry at that point.
Yeah, yeah. I think focus on the
human trafficking, probably not a confessor, but yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a priest. I don't give moral.
Sure.
I don't give even like basic questions people will ask me sometimes that I know the answer to. I always forward them on to priests. Like, no, I don't do this. Sorry. But so anyone with the standing intention to profit justly qualifies to take in the modern world, according to Cardinal Rowe. And Rowe's Noonan, who wrote the best book on Usury. They're probably still the best book.
We got to await your book on Usury, man. I mean,
well, maybe one day. But so Noonan says Rowe's is one of the best presentations of the old theory ever made, and I think that's right. Like Noonan or Rowe he's so sharp, and like the way he interacts with economists like von Bauberg, some of his criticisms of von Bauberg, he's just. I still think he's wrong, but he's just so clever. But really importantly, this doesn't mean that people don't commit sins with money. Like sometimes when people hear stuff like this, they think what you're saying is that nobody ever commits sins with money. That's not what Rowe is saying. It's not what I would argue for, right? Anytime you act out of greed, right?
Sure,
you're committing a sin, right? Because the kind of act is designated from the end in traditional Catholic action theory. So if you're acting from a bad end, the whole act is bad, even if sort of you might be doing something that is in principle okay. But this does mean that there's now a universal presumption in favor of being able to take interest, as long as your intention is good. Okay.
So don't worry about usury. You're innocent until proven guilty. Really, we need to worry more about the classic things like greed, envy, jealousy, etc. All right. Okay, so we got to hit some objections. And I like the way we've been carving it out. Like somebody who's listening to this could say, you know what, I don't really want to stray at all from Aquinas. I want to stick to what he said. And I think we've actually outlined some ways that you can be in line with the scholastic tradition with Aquinas and still understand that in the modern economy, there are a variety, if not a plethora of ways to loan and receive interest. Or we kind of highlighted there's places personally we would nitpick with certain things that certain very, very conservative voices inside of select parts of the tradition have voiced and say, yeah, I don't think that's quite correct. So you can choose your path here, but I think either way, even if you're very cautious, you should be able to go along with the church and presume that people are innocent of the sin of usury in the modern economy.
Yeah, I think that's important. And one of the reasons I wrote the paper was that I wanted people to realize that you can hold the traditional position and still make sense of sort of the Vatican's allowances. Even though I don't hold the traditional position like that, I still think that's a live option.
Yep, I think so.
Okay,
Yep.
so should we run through some objections?
Let's hit some objections. I'm ready.
Okay, so I've got three thinkers that I deal with the objections from more recent journal articles on usury. So the first one is Jeremy Bell, who wrote a long article in which he claims that Bell claims Rowe argues for a universal right to lucre and justice on the right to a possibility of profit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I already showed this isn't right. He says he attributes this view to Ben Rowe, but I don't think Bill has read Ben Rowe, or it's pretty clear to me he hasn't. He's relying on Noonan's summary of Rowe, and as a summary, that's fine, but it leads Bell to get Rowe's position. Rowe explicitly rejects that you can move from a sort of possibility of earning money to a claim on lucre and justice. And this is why Rowe spends a lot of time on the necessary intention part. And Bell never cites Rowe. So I think this is really just kind of outrageous that he would sort of... Here, let me read the section. I have it up now. So in a 1903 dissertation setting forth what Noonan described as one of the ablest presentations of the old theory ever made, the Belgian theologian Joseph Ernst van Rowe defended the universal claiming of lucre and justice by lenders on the grounds that in today's economy, every holder of money can employ profitably, and to forgo money's use in a loan gives every lender a right to interest. The words I have italicized contain what Aquinas would surely regard as the fallacy in this reasoning. While every holder of money can employ it profitably, not every holder of money has the knowledge to do so or actually intends to do so. Consequently, the right to claim compensation for lucre and justice upon lending is certainly not universal. So the point is, right, Bell's gotten Van Rowe wrong because he hasn't read it. And that's leading him to attribute this position that Van Rowe never holds. Right? As a simple matter of logic, Bell's right. But since he gets Rowe wrong, and since he gets St. Alphonsus, since he gets the earlier tradition wrong, it just leads him totally astray. And the second point here is that this point about, well, every holder of money can employ money profitably, not every holder of money has the know-how to do so or actually intends to do so. So the know-how is it doesn't take a lot of know-how to do this, right? You just need to be able to open,
go to the bank,
account or right, or so invest in or buy treasury bonds or open a 401k. Right? This is within the reach of ordinary people, right? And so then the second mistake Bell makes is he says, quote, "It would be absurd for someone who makes loans for a living to claim that every time he has made a loan, he was on the way to having profits from some investment that he would have made before this loan." Okay? So here, Bell is saying, well, you can't have professional lenders, right? They can't charge lucre and justice because because they're professional lenders, they're not giving any. But St. Alphonsus has already dealt with subjection, right? St. Alphonsus has said he can. And so I think, again, it's clear that Bell hasn't read Noonan's whole book because Noonan is also.
And further, it's like, okay, you're a professional lender. Then, I mean, if you're lending your own money, then you're giving up that. If you're lending somebody else's money and then you're receiving a return, then you're actually being paid for your labor. So it's like, which either one seems perfectly reasonable. Yeah, I think the idea that, didn't Aquinas talk about earlier, you could have your crops virtually in the respect that if you were planting it into the ground and then you're somehow prevented from doing so, now you lose this. So I just think to be in line with the scholastic tradition is to say that potential is a real feature of the universe, and that it's something that we, like, it is hashtag Aristotle, and I don't see a problem with pricing for it. And further, there's another big change in the modern economy, and that is what they say, hey, the potential to be, I don't know, repaid or the potential to profit. It's very uncertain. That can be true if we're dealing with one enterprise or a single loan, but when you aggregate these things, this is no longer true. It's like, the example of the little particles in quantum physics. Well, they have a possibility of being here, there, that, or that. But once you get a bazillion of them together, we just use regular Newtonian physics and say, nope, the ball hits the other one and it bounces left.
Right.
This is the way it will predictably work. So when we aggregate loans, we can actually get a very, very accurate idea of what percentage of them will fail. And when we aggregate investments, we get a very accurate understanding of what the return on equity would be. So the modern economy, the pooling of these things, I think, eliminates a lot of these objections.
And the kind of certainty you're interested in action is not, it's not demonstrative certainty, right? That's demonstrative certainty is epistemic certainty. So you have the demonstrative certainty that, like, the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. But in action, what you worry about is moral certainty, right? And that's a lower standard, right? So I think you can be morally certain that you're going to earn the going rate of profit.
Sure.
Right? Even though, right, it is possible that, like,
hit by a meteorite.
We're hit by a meteorite, and there's, like, we're all back in the Stone Age.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So then, you want to move on to the next objection?
Sure. Let's do the next one.
Okay. So the next objection comes from this book by Brian McCall, and he argues that fractional reserve banking leads to usury. And so here's a quote where he kind of lays out what he thinks. Quote, modern banking law permits banks to lend money they do not have. They merely create the money by book entry as a deposit in the account of the borrower. We might legitimately ask, what loss does such a lender incur when he lends money that would not exist but for the loan and ceases to exist when the loan is repaid? Even if the purchasing power of a dollar declines by 6% over a 2-year period, has the lender suffered a loss? If the loan money is destroyed upon repayment, the money only exists for the extension of the loan. So the idea here is that since the banks create money out of thin air when they lend, and he says out of thin air in another quote, that they don't have a tighter lucrum chestnut because they're not giving up anything by lending. Now, the problem here, as I'm sure you've realized by now, is that he doesn't understand how fractional reserve banking works.
Right. I understand why he's saying what he's saying, but I mean, if this were truly the case, I would not be podcasting. I would be opening a bank immediately. But sadly, you actually first require to have certain deposits. And then when you have these deposits, you can loan out a proportion of them. So let's say 90%, though I think legally you can loan them all out right now, but you're going to need to keep some cash on hand in order to deal with demand deposits, which come in and out, to secure against risk of insolvency, etc. I just heard my neighbor's lawnmower start. Listeners may have also. So I'll use an analogy. Imagine that a company opens up and says, hey, I got this awesome idea. You guys only mow your lawn like once every week or two. So there's a lot of excess mower capacity. So what if you all brought your mower and you parked it in my warehouse? Okay. Now, here's the cool thing about it, though. I'm going to loan out of the 100 mowers, 90 of the mowers in general. I'm going to rent them. And then people can rent a mower from my mower warehouse and then mow their lawns. Okay, well, that's pretty cool. What happens if I need to mow my lawn, like, urgently? They say, that's cool, man. I'll keep 10 lawnmowers around. So if any of you guys, my customers, need to mow, it should be fine because you only mow every 14 days. I have 10 mowers. So, it'll be all right. We say, right, but what if we all need to mow immediately because it rained? They go, well, let's back it on up. There's other warehouses which are renting mowers, have a similar scheme, and it's very easy. At that point, I promise you I will get you a mower, but here's what I'll do. I'll just rent it from the other warehouse, and then I'll have it, and then I can give it to you. You'd go, this is kind of cool. What's in it for me? And they'll go, well, because it's your mower, it belongs to you, and I'm renting it out. I get a little bit for running the whole warehousing thing. And I mean, you can tell this is a bit complicated, but I'll cut you in on a significant portion of the rent of your lawnmower. And, there's a check against this because you could go to the other warehouse and they might be able to do it more effectively and efficiently. And then we're going to have this balancing of like where the mowers go and then what the rent is. Maybe we could have a Federal Reserve, which changes the inter-rent between all of the warehouses so that then they have to stock a larger or smaller amount because it's more costly to rent the marginal mower in the event of a mower shortage. It can get complicated, but what I can tell you here, and why I went on this what seems to be rabbit trail, is the warehouse did not create mowers from thin air through the act of loaning. However, and this is important, it is true that many people have claims on the use of many mowers. In fact, at some point, since we have people owning it, we have people renting it, we have contracts between the banks, the total amount of claims, sure, might exceed the total amount of mowers. But because the use of the mowers is subject to the market rate of rent, we can actually clear such things. I could go into more depth, but I think that when we think about money as this crazy abstract thing, it gets confusing. When we think about it as lawnmowers, though, I think it clears some things up. So in this case, I'm just going to say he doesn't quite understand it.
Right? We love a complicated analogy.
Of course.
But the point is, right, is that banks don't create money ex nihilo. Ordinary banks. The Federal Reserve does, but banks create money by loaning out deposits, right? And it's true they do create money, but that's not ex nihilo. And if the bank can legitimately use its deposited money for other legitimate business investments, which McCall never disputes, right, then the bank will have a claim to Lucrum Chess.
Right. And okay, I got to make it slightly more complicated. Technically speaking, there's a distinction between like broad money and narrow money. And what we typically use is credit. So it's like the right to use a mower or the use of a mower, etc. There's also like narrow money, which would be more like the mower itself is narrow money. So what banks do is they can expand and reduce credit. And that's a response to demand for that credit. And that's fine. And any type of increase in the quantity of credit, which is used as currency, that increased is a signage benefit so that somebody gets the first use of that new credit that can be used in transactions. That's true. But then that is actually arbitraged away, right? Banks compete. So banks get that, but then they have to compete with other banks, which means that's returned to the original depositors. So it's similar to just the paying of some of the rent. And I know I use rent in two radically different contexts here. This is non-immoral rent. This is lawnmower rent, guys, not rents, meaning the monopolistic ability to extract over the market rate. So in that case, we would return the signage to the depositors, which represents their desire to forego profit opportunities, the ability to have liquidity in exchange for increasing the capital stock for others with a lawnmower stock, for others who wish to use that more urgently than themselves. So this does get complicated, but I think that kind of the headlines are, it's not quite so simple as banks make money ex nihilo. There's multiple types of money. There's credit, there's this, there's narrow money. The Federal Reserve could totally be more guilty of this. I think quantitative easing would be a case of creating money from nothing. But all that aside, creating money from nothing is not synonymous with usury. If anything, I would classify it in the worst case when I'm feeling mean as a type of fraud, right? Because you're representing the value of currency at a given demand as X. Then you are changing the value of dollar by changing the quantity of dollars given the same demand by Y, and therefore you are misrepresenting the value. So it'd be similar to the devaluing of the devaluing of coins mentioned in the Bible, where it says, your coins are corroding. It means you've mixed base metal in with precious metals, and now we see that you've debased it. So it's a different type of sin, different type of podcast.
So McCall and everybody who kind of says this, Bell says this, and the next guy I deal with, Stork, says something like this too. They all cite Father Bernard Dempsey's book. And Dempsey was a really interesting guy. He was a Jesuit priest with a doctorate in theology. And he wrote an economics dissertation with Joseph Schumpeter, the creative destruction guy, on comparing interest theory in modern economists to the late scholastics. I think he uses Molino, Lugo, and Lessius. And Dempsey thinks that sort of seigniorage or Cantillon effects that banks get from they benefit from having the money first. He thinks that is analogous to usury, but I think that because these guys, they don't have the economic chops to understand what Dempsey's doing, I actually think Dempsey's probably wrong, although I'm sympathetic to the case he's trying to make. But a lot of these guys miss the distinction. Dempsey's a really sophisticated guy. I would recommend that book to anybody. But what they're saying is different than what Dempsey's saying, even though they all cite him and they think they're saying what Dempsey's saying.
Gotcha. Okay. So, are we on to the next objection?
Yeah.
Cool.
I think so. Okay, so Thomas Stork, who's he's a distributist guy. He's a distributist author. No. I think there are a lot of things wrong with distributists, but it's not like there are a lot of things wrong with distributists, and there are a lot of things wrong with the world. But not many things of the things that are wrong with the world are wrong because they've been listening to distributists, right?
Well, nobody really listens to distributists. Actually, more and more people listen to them.
So to be fair to the distributists, it's not. They do have ideas that have bad effects, but it's not like they're actually being effective in these ideas implemented. So I don't think it's fair to go after them too hard about it. I'm reminded of Kant, right? So Kant, when he discusses in the Critique of Pure Reason, he discusses the categories. He says Aristotle's a worthy man, but his effort wasn't systematic enough, right? He's just kind of working at random when Aristotle discusses his categories, but Kant is much more scientific, right? I'm reminded of that with these distributist guys. They're all really worthy guys, but because they're not sort of proceeding in the correct manner, they're just kind of flailing around almost talking about economics.
It's like
it leads them to say some kind of goofy stuff.
It's good intentions, I think, sometimes. So some of them are just it's just wild tribalism. I like me and mine more than you and yours. Like, screw this whole everybody's my neighbor nonsense. It's just there's some of that, but in general, I think they're trying to aim at a better world. It's just whenever you just shake them and say, give me an idea, an actual idea, a real policy proposal, you get some shocking nonsense that has these wild unintended consequences, in large part because they seem to try to do economics using theology. And they have this kind of messed up idea of subsidiarity. They're like, well, theology is the queen of the sciences. Economics is the science. Boom. It's like, right. But a queen is not a dictator. And a kingdom does not mean that whoever is at the top just steamrolls everybody underneath. Economics is competent in economics. And theology is competent in theology. And we can't just put our theologian hats on and come up with nonsense.
Yeah, so for people who are interested in distributism, I think Alexander Salter has a new book out, The Political Economy of Distributism. And Alexander Salter, he's a really good economist. He did his dissertation at George Mason University. But he's read these distributist guys. He's read Chesterton and Belloc. And he's actually sympathetic to a lot of what they're trying to do. But because he's got real economics chops, he can read them and sort of take out what's good and sort of put it together with his real knowledge of economics in a way that I read the book, but I've listened to interviews with him, and it seems like a good book.
Maybe we'll have him on the show one of these days.
Yeah, you should. So moving on to Stork. Sorry.
Right, I'm probably going to go on more tirades. I know what's coming up. For the listeners who don't know, we had wild, crazy things destroy pretty much our last version of this podcast / YouTube. So this is take 2, and I know that I have a trigger warning here for myself. So all right.
So Stork claims that in an economic downturn, quote, a lack of consumer demand makes spending on productive investment unprofitable. So it is likely that someone putting money out at Mutual is not truly foregoing investment profit, because no profit is to be had for the time being. Right? Just wanted to give him to. So what Stork has done here is he said, and he cites Paul Samuelson's famous economics term, is he said, well, in an economic downturn, the average rate of profit goes way down. So, therefore, it's likely that someone lending in this period of time is not actually giving up profit because there's no general rate of profit at all to be had. But this is confused, right? Because in an economic downturn, well, that's sort of the signature effects of an economic downturn is a shortage of cash, right? And this is part of why generally a inverted yield curve is a good predictor of recessions, right? And so actually, if you're holding cash during an economic downturn, it's very likely that your profit opportunities are going to go up substantially, right? Because the prices of assets are going to decline, especially including productive assets. And so if you're lending that money out instead of using it to buy resources, then you're actually probably giving up more than you might be giving up at another time, right? And so he actually, because Stork doesn't understand the economics here, he has the situation backwards, right? It's actually possible to bring it down to the concessions could be higher.
100 and a bazillion %. Like this objection to me is like a raging pile of steaming, burning economic illiteracy at the highest level. If somebody sometimes with like philosophy, theology, and whatnot, you can actually see it work in the real world. And like for us theists, we believe God made this world. So it's like if it really doesn't match reality, it doesn't match what God laid out, this should really be a red flag. Like you see certain people try to live out like nihilist philosophies and just things do not go well. When we try to live this out, it would be the worst economic move possible because we would literally be stuck in the very first recession that ever happened to humanity. Because instead of lending out and increasing the quantity of capital, searching out every possible new profit opportunity as prices are rapidly changing, we just contract at this point, and then we lose the ability to dynamically find new ways to serve our neighbor by deploying the now scarce amount of capital, which is absolutely necessary to to compound, to leverage productivity, to increase wages, to increase consumption, to generate more investment income, etc., etc. Then there's your point that the idea that you don't have any productive uses of this because the average rate of return is low is so false on so many levels. One, because that's the average. That is not, there is many things in the average. Like there are times where there's things going down and there are things which are going up. So to say, because the average is 0, we shouldn't invest is to say we ought not invest in good, profitable places whereby many different participants in the market will all benefit because there are people who, if we aggregated them together, would yield a 0 return. That's ridiculous. That's like saying I have a pizza and it's moldy on one half and good on the other. So if on average it's not good, throw it away, which might be good advice for pizza. So I could probably come up with a better example. If your pizza's at all moldy, just get a new damn pizza. But the point is, because there are bad investments does not mean you should throw away the opportunity to do good investments, which is exactly what would pull you out of the freaking recession in the first place. And then we're not just looking at the investment in terms of its cash value today, right? Because there are plenty of good investments that don't have positive cash flow today. When Ford was setting up his giant assembly line, that took a lot of money and he had negative cash flows, I guarantee. But that was in service of great profit-making ability into the future. So instead, the value of some of that stock would be the present value of all future cash flows, at which point, let's say during a recession taking Ford again, their shares dropped to like $2 a share. Well, should we just not invest in them? No, that's a wonderful time to invest in them. That's buying low, selling high. This is investing number like 101 kind of stuff. And then it would be discounted based on risk-free rate of return, all the other typical factors, and we would simply get, on average, a similar return to any other point of the market because we would just discount the capital that we're buying and selling. So just so many things that drive me nuts with this. I'm sure I've forgotten some. It just seems like this would be the worst possible thing ever. He's jacking up the effective interest rates during a recession. So he's raising the hurdle rate for any type of new productive enterprise during a recession. Stork. Okay, cool. I think that's out of my system.
But like I said, it's not like people are taking distributor's advice, right? So I'm not too worried about it.
Okay, so nobody's taking his advice. Thank goodness, for great reasons.
The point is, right? And this is something really hammers, is that you have to be very careful when you're jamming really abstract philosophical principles down to the real, right? The world is really complicated, and usually there's some sort of wrinkle in reality that will prevent things from fitting quite the way you think they will. Right? And so, for these people who want to sort of jam Thomas's argument, right, onto the modern world, it's a continual problem that because they don't understand the later tradition, because they don't understand the economics, right, they don't actually see how they fit together. And Cardinal Rowley, who understands the tradition maybe better than the last 200 years, and who also understands the economics really well. Because of those two things, he's able to fit these two together and show how they can go together in a way that's not actually contradictory. Okay, so I think that's it for the paper.
Okay, cool. We made it through.
Some other things we could hit.
Cool. Let's rapid fire any remaining objections, I suppose. And I hear my baby in the background. Yeah, let's rapid fire any remaining objections, which you kind of hear floating around. Maybe some people who have responded to your article clapped back at, as it were. So, what do we have?
Well, so I think the first thing, and I probably should have said this up front, is you shouldn't be forming your life around what random people on the internet think, including me, right?
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't form your life around what I think or what someone else thinks. You should be forming your life around what the church tells you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's true, right? There are problems in the hierarchy right now. There are people staying and promoting things they shouldn't, right now. But the usury question is different, right? We've got almost 200 years of the church. We've got so the majority of time now, since this has been an issue, it's been pretty permissive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So since the end of the 16th century, at least. And then we've got almost 200 years of the church telling ordinary people to not worry too much about this, right? And this is very different than sort of anything you might be concerned about explaining them now. Right? People who want to undermine or overturn the church's teaching on homosexuality or birth control. Right? This is just different.
Right. You are not a better Catholic for saying, I refuse to loan at interest or engage in this type of stuff. And you're not being more true to the church by doing that.
If the church were to double back down on this, which I think is criminal, right? If they would go back to like pre-1830s position, right? Then in your life, you should do what the church says, even though I wouldn't change my mind about the intellectual piece here, right? But now let's move on to a couple other objections that I've heard from other people that I don't deal with in the article. So the first one of these is the intention objection. It's an objection that when you lend, you inherently intend to alienate any benefits that would accrue to you from the money. This is the best one. This is the best objection. I think certainly Aquinas would have held this, although I don't think he says it. And this objection did hold sway for a decently long time. But So it's already, but already like I think in the 15th century, maybe earlier, maybe the 14th century, they're already starting to say, well, if you encounter someone who's desperately poor and they ask you to lend them, then you can charge them leave interest because you're coerced by by their need to lend.
Right.
You're not. So it's only voluntary, conditional. Okay. So Saint Antoninus says this. He's an archbishop. He's the Archbishop of Florence, I think, in the 15th century. And he's a hardliner on usury. So, but even he's willing to concede this one. And so, the people who take this intentional objection really, really seriously, Michael Humphreys has a book, or has an article in a book from CUA Press, where he tries to take this a stronger position than Saint Antoninus. Right. So he's taking the strongest position that like anyone's taken in probably 600 years. But a little bit later, I think in the 16th century, Konrad Sumenhard develops an objection to this view that says, well, why can't you just assent conditional? Right? Why can't you just say, so, okay, I assent to alienating my money, but I don't assent to giving up all these opportunities. Like I still want to be repaid for those.
Sure.
And this is the position that like later Thomas, like Saint Alphonsus Liguori explicitly holds this position. And I've heard it objected that, well, you can't do this with other contracts. You can't do this with marriage, for example. You can't reserve your other opportunities, right? When you get married, but you give up all those opportunities. But I mean, the problem with that objection, I think, is that marriage isn't governed by community justice. There's no
right. That's a terrible analog. Like, yeah.
So, well, more importantly, right? If you're going to allow the lender to deduct for direct expenses, like Aquinas seems to, right? So, I will lend you, but my money's in this other town, and so I need you to cover my costs, right? It seems really ad hoc to say you're not going to allow deducting for indirect expenses, right? So, like, go back to the medical case I outlined, right? In the case where I'll lend to you, but I want you to pay because I have to cancel the surgery, right? And the doctor's going to charge me a fee, so I want you to pay the fee, right? You can charge them, but you can't charge in the case where the surgery becomes more expensive because your condition gets worse.
Yeah, it seems not a principled distinction.
Yeah, that seems really ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
So I really have trouble seeing how someone can hold the line on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Although I agree, this is the best objection to the position of outline.
And I mean, I don't know if we kicked it in already, but a lot of these guys are saying, sure, if you do have another opportunity that you could engage in a partnership or what we would think of as like an equity stake in a business, and you could be getting profit from this, then it would be reasonable that you could then charge that rate. And then we kind of gotten into that with the triple contract stuff is kind of the next stage after that. But here in the modern economy, a ginormous change is that we have debt and equity for sale being bought and sold by the picosecond right now with crazy high frequency trading. And if there was some amount of gain, like some amount of like usury or some amount of rents, which was present in, say, the bond market with debt, and you would get a lower risk adjusted return in equities, then the market would just hit equilibrium, right? Everybody would start selling equities and purchasing bonds and purchasing debt, and then they would just remove that opportunity to receive over and above what the market rate would do. So the market itself is guarding, to the extent that we have knowledge in the market, to the extent that people are self-interested, which they are, to get rid of any type of over and above unjust, not reflective of opportunity cost, not reflective of inflation risk and risk of loss, etc., type of gains. So to me, it seems in the modern economy, a lot of what were concerned about for a variety of reasons is just gone. And that's one of the many changes.
Yeah, I know. There's no I think it's really important that the arbitrage. So if you take Van Roy's view, then it might be the case that any sort of profit above the sort of going rate would be usury, right? So maybe this makes sense of why the church seems to have switched to a excessive charge definition of
That
usury.
makes sense.
But it's really important that the market contains mechanisms to arbitrage that away automatically.
100%.
It's open to variation, right? Because there's just variation in estimation of what the just price is.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And then for a lot of people like to point to like payday loans, 35% interest, 50% interest, crazy stuff like that. As well, that's got to be usury because it's so high. It's like, well, the risk of loss is enormous for the lender. Go ahead, go into the hood, find somebody who randomly goes, dude, I'm totally broke and I need a loan. Go ahead and try to, do you really think they're making money hand over fist? They have high risk of loss. Further, it can make sense that these people might want to pay a very high interest rate because the marginal value of a dollar is very high when you have very few dollars. So if you need food today, you're willing to pay a pretty high interest rate for that. An interest rate that we might not be willing to pay. And that is a market going on there. Now, it can be that there can be immoral things going on. Maybe they're being tricked or coerced, or maybe they're being hyped up. Oh, yeah, it's going to be awesome. You're going to live this wonderful life. But to me, it seems like I would sooner classify any type of nonsense going on there as a different type of sin, right? Maybe you're tempting somebody to imprudence, but I don't necessarily see how you're going to meet some classic definition of usury there, specifically because there's a competitive market. Like it or not, there's many loan sharks. There's many type of payday loans on offer. So it is a market rate that is high, but it reflects a massive amount of demand from these people who are willing to pay that in order to have that cash on hand.
And that might still be a bad thing.
Might still be a bad thing. I'm willing to think that this is a bad thing, but I think it would be because of like an information asymmetry problem and that you're basically pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. But I want to hesitate to be so paternalistic to be like, let's just rip away their access to easy, quick capital. You mentioned how at one point, in the Middle Ages, they got really strict about these usury provisions and they were shutting down the ability to borrow. And the people who objected were the poor. And that should be pretty obvious. If we cut off the ability to borrow, well then, wow, that's going to be pretty problematic for those of us who aren't fabulously wealthy and swimming in gold coins that we can just use for all of our regular long-term durable purchases.
I think the point here is it might be bad. Like payday lending might be bad from a policy perspective. It might have all kinds of bad consequences.
Sure.
Maybe you should inhibit it. But let's have the policy conversation. Let's not just call it usury and try to sign a clause.
Agreed. We are talking about usury. And not everything that involves money and is bad is usury. When you go buy some meth, that's a bad use of money, not usury.
Sure. So a couple other things. So someone asked me, I didn't want to talk about this, but someone explicitly asked me about whether or not my article relies on assuming investing in the stock market is moral. And Jacob Imam and Mark Barnes had this article out arguing it's immoral. And the short answer is no. My argument does not assume that, right? Because bonds are not stock market investments. Those are probably closer to the census than root to them.
Sure.
That's something I agree with Michael Humphreys about. Who has the Billy Street position. He's a really nice guy. Or interest-bearing savings accounts. I already talked about what Ben Roy says about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could turn out that investing in the stock market is immoral, but for other reasons, there's still this universal presumption in favor of quiescence. But so my article doesn't matter where you come down on that. But I do want to say I think there's some really goofy stuff going on in that article.
Mm-hmm. I did a 2-part episode where I believe that's the one that I read. And if people got hoodwinked into believing that kind of stuff, I would certainly point them to some of those older podcasts where I go through. Trent Horn did a debate. I did a debrief of Trent Horn after he debated on that. There's a lot of things that I just really don't like, and some things which are just straight up contradictions, it seems. One that I highlight is they say, 1, hey, all these stocks are just traded in a secondary market, therefore it doesn't actually affect the company. I'm like, well, that's not okay. You don't understand the stock market, but whatever. That's your one point. And the next one is, well, purchasing stock is entering into a partnership. We shouldn't partner with anybody who's evil. Many of these companies are evil because they support evil things. Ergo, we can't possibly purchase the stock. I'm like, whoa, like you can't hold these two objections at the same time. One is it's entirely disconnected and does not benefit the company. And two, you're entering into this partnership by benefiting the company by giving them money. It's like, what you doing, guys?
It seems like, I don't know as much about how the stock market works, but it seems like they're playing fast and loose with a lot of the definitions and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, at one point, who was it? It was either Economist or might have been Bonson. I decided, you know what, a lot of people are interested in this distributist or new polity kind of things. I'll just kind of pitch one or two of these kind of objections to one of them. And it was funny when you ask like a real like person who is an investment manager for billions of dollars, or you ask a real economist, you don't get, we're nice. Me and Matt are super nice. Okay. I will go through and I will read the article and I will nicely explain using the example of Susie's lemonade stand. What they did, and I forget which interview is, if I remember, I'll link it or something. They just went, wait, what? Wait, I'm sorry. No, I wouldn't, they just don't understand anything about the stock market, so they shouldn't be rendering any opinions. That's silly. And I mean, again, me and Matt here, we're very nice. We will engage in that. But when you deal with real professionals who actually understand this, when they see this type of content, they kind of just laugh at it and dismiss it. And honestly, I think that's kind of for good reason. And I think we ought to take these people who are experts in the subject a little bit more seriously and not just assume that because we read Chesterton a bunch of times, we can all of a sudden just like bowl over the economic system with our great new knowledge.
Yeah. So, yeah, and there's other stuff going on. Like, I know that they're used to John Hall too. I spent a few hours one night tracking that down, and they're really playing fast in this.
And then their quotes of Rerum Novarum and stuff. I did a 6-part series reading all of Rerum Novarum and going through it, guys. Listen to that. It's not what a lot of people seem to think.
Yeah, they make a claim about what the Greek of the New Testament says. And it's just like they cite 2 dictionaries. I checked the dictionaries. The dictionaries don't even say anything close to what they say.
Right.
There are some real problems there. I don't really understand.
Well, in that dictionary, it was like, instead of dealing with the definition or the etymology, it was like, use it in a sentence. And then the sentence happened to relate to something, and they're like, so, pumpkins can be shot out of an air cannon. Therefore, there's a connection between pumpkins and air cannons. No, not necessarily. I just use pumpkin in a sentence.
There's one more conviction I want to go through. One more kind of interesting thing about whether or not inflation gives a right to an extrinsic title.
Okay. All right. Cool.
This one's interesting because there's weird stuff here. So Stork thinks inflation can give a claim to an extrinsic title.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael Humphreys, in the article in the CUA Press book, is really critical of this idea because, and actually he's got a point, right? If you hold the sort of scholastic, the units are equivalent thing, right? Then I think he's got a point. But there are a few things you need to be aware of when you think about this. So one is that in the traditional view, when the scholastics talk about this, they allow for it. Right. And that's because, and it's really easy for them to allow because they're dealing with precious metal currency, and they're talking about debasing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but if you debase it, right? So if you increase the quantity of copper in the silver coin by 10%, they're no longer really the same thing.
Sure.
So now they can trade at a ratio, right?
100%.
But when you have a fiat currency, right? Is it really true that the Fed, like, turning on the quantitative easing cannon, right? Is that really changing the nature of what the dollar is?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, like, to me, I'm just like, yes, because at this point, it's like, in the end, money is meant to be a measure. And if I'm like, hey, man, I want to give you 1 foot of string cheese, you're like, okay, thanks, man. And then I return, I'm like, hey, I actually changed a foot to
The measure
this
changes.
big, and I'm going to give you back 1 foot of string cheese. You'd be like, you jerk. Like, you're calling it a foot of string cheese, but you changed the definition of a foot. Like, you jerk. Like, you're not giving me an equivalent amount of string cheese. So when we
Yeah, so maybe it's
change
like
the buying power of a dollar by increasing the quantity, we've changed the measure.
yeah. So and I think there's actually a point to this. I actually haven't decided what I think about this. But so there's a point here though, because for the scholastics and for Aristotle, right, what makes money valuable is your ability to exchange it for other things.
Okay.
Right. And so if the government, who's sort of charged with sort of shepherding the value of that currency, does something that changes the value, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can make an argument that actually they have changed the nature of it. It's a bit like if you take the meter from Paris, like there's a metal meter in Paris, which is the official meter. It's the meter. It's the meter by which all meters are measured. And if you heat it up and you change have you made it longer than a meter? Right? It's sort of that kind of a question. Wittgenstein could be talking about this, but so I think maybe there's a point there. But I also think, right, even if Humphreys is right that it doesn't change the nature of the dollar, you can still account for a title to an extrinsic title for inflation as a kind of Euclid, right? So like you're giving up the ability to spend the money at a higher value.
Sure. 100%.
In exchange for using it at a lower value. And Lugo seems to allow that, right? So it's also a bit like St. Alphonsus' net example, right? The ability to decide to go fishing is worth something. So the ability to spend the money at the higher value is worth something. So if you're going to give that up for someone else's benefit, it seems like justice. You should be positive.
Sure. It's like, I don't know. I'm just still stuck on like new example. Matt's like, dude, you look like a communist in that shirt. Olive green's not your color. And I'm like, oh crap, thanks, Matt, And he goes, I'll tell you what. We're about the same size. 7 feet tall, solid muscle, both of us. You can't tell from the camera angle. He'll lend me a shirt, all right? And it's an extra large. So I'm going to borrow his extra large shirt. I don't realize that it's like hand wash only. So I throw it in my dryer and I shrink it. And it comes out only fit for my little baby. And I go, hey man, it says XL right here. It is the same shirt. And I hand him back his tiny little shirt. And I'm like, I have done you no wrong. I think you'd be like, dude, I can't really use it the same way that I used it before because it only comes up to my belly button and like it stops here. I'd be like, listen, I know the use is different now, but it says extra large. But it's not extra large, Jake. I don't care because I've bought into dude's inflation argument and I think usury is everywhere and I'm going to give you a shrunken shirt.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of, to me, he kind of does. Like, he's really honed in on the nature of the contract, the nature of the Mouton contract.
Okay.
I think, like, and having read way too much of this stuff, I think he's right to do that. Like, I think if you want to defend a strong view like he does, that's what you need to do. But on the other hand, one is, it seems like it undermines sort of the broader scholastic commitments about what money is, and sort of this Aristotle about why money is valuable. And I also think, right, you can also account for it in terms of Lucretius. Now he denies the validity of Lucretius, like in a lot of the cases I outlined, because he holds a strong view. But he holds the intention objection. He thinks the intention objection that I gave earlier works to Lucretius. But yeah, I don't know.
So to kind of sum up, there was a period in the church where they were pretty strict, though it wasn't in the East really ever. We should look at the church's broad tradition. We should look at the current church in the current economy, not an ancient or medieval church in an entirely different economy for how to live in today's economy. Today, we have the Vatican purchasing bonds, issuing debt, and engaging like pretty much every other nation, because it's a little tiny nation, in the financial system without a problem, without a condemnation. We understand that like the theologians that we have gone through, many of which are pretty conservative, have given a variety of different ways that we can charge interest because we have extrinsic titles. The two big categories pretty much encompass all of the traditional reasons for why one would charge interest on a loan. We now have a modern economy which would hunt usury down and kill it by just arbitraging away such gains. We all have the ability to get an extrinsic title because of the massive amounts of banking that we can enjoy. Not every type of money sin is usury. Certainly don't go into getting interest on anything you loan with a greedy, envious, jealous, or otherwise evil intention. But that's not because it's necessary usury, because, well, again, usury is not every monetary sin. You can even be in line with the tradition of Thomas Aquinas and other scholastics and be on our side that interest does not equal usury. And a lot of these people who have their head so far into these arguments and get themselves mixed up come out with unbelievably terrible suggestions, which would legitimately hurt people, like trying to raise a family and have a community and fund good things and live a good life and heck, build cathedrals, etc. And I think that we should not call evil what is good and not call good what is evil. So it means that we need to just judge rightly, like Scripture says. I don't know. I'm still open to the idea that you shouldn't be charging your friends and family interest, but that's because it's a diffusion of goods across a very small space, and it's an action within friendship. And it doesn't need to be as economically accurate of a transaction as you would need if you're going to compound it with a bazillion others across a worldwide economic network. Because when you start screwing up prices at that level, people really do suffer. When you allow somebody to borrow $100 who's your friend who needs it, there are no detrimental common good consequences. If we take a very strict view of what usury is, that is really unique to only certain thinkers inside of certain sections of the tradition at certain times, then we could absolutely be harming the common good and grievously. I guess that's kind of my takeaway. I want to hear what your takeaway, if everybody just spaced this whole podcast and they've only tuned in for this last bit, and they've maybe read a lot of these usury hawks who have mixed them up in a variety of ways. What are you going to tell them? They're fretting. They're in the confessional thinking, I'm just going to focus on usury this confession. And you say, hold on, little buddy. Matt's here to set you straight. Give up.
Well, I shouldn't be. The only time I should be in the confessional is the penitent. But
I don't know. Something happened. You were there.
But if I was going to sum all this up, it would just be that the tradition allows charging for opportunity cost. Aquinas might not allow for that, but the tradition does, and I think the tradition has compelling reasons for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And because of our current economic circumstances, there's always opportunity costs. So as long as you intend to profit justly and you're charging the market rate, the going market rate of profit, which you would be, then you're okay, and you don't really need to worry too much about this. The goal of the article was just to outline how the tradition developed, because that seemed to be a lacuna. And so I think, hopefully I've done that. I hope people read the article, and I hope they like it. If they have any questions, they can email you, and you can just forward these on me.
Perfect. Yep. The Gordian Knot 101 at gmail.com. I'll shoot it over to Matt.
Okay, great. I think that's it.
We did it.
Thanks, Jake.
We did it. We did it on take 2. I hope people understand usury a wee bit better. Cool. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much, Matt.
All right. Thank you. Have a great day.